Member for Vancouver Fairview.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'm pleased to stand to speak to Bill 28. I'd be even more pleased if we had addressed this issue a number of months ago, or a year ago, or a couple of years ago. And I'd also be more pleased if there was more substance and meat to the bill before us. But I will say, as my colleague from Vancouver Point Grey and others have said, this bill is better than what we have today. Honourable Speaker, the bill is called Miscellaneous Statutes, Housing Priority Initiatives. Honourable Speaker, it's about time we had some housing priority initiatives in this legislature, in this province. The benchmark price for a home in Metro Vancouver increased by 32% in the last year. Think about that, Honourable Speaker. Vancouver has always been a hot housing market. It has been a market in which people have thought for a long, long time, years, perhaps more than a decade, that house prices in Vancouver were astronomical, that they couldn't have gone higher, and yet they keep going higher. But, Honourable Speaker, in the last year, 32%. And that results, not just for me, but for many of my colleagues representing constituencies in Greater Vancouver, in Metro Vancouver, and I suspect for others on the government side of the House who might not talk about it as much, but we see angst, we see concern in our constituents. I regularly have people come into my office who I assume are there to talk about housing. They're actually there to talk about their kids' education, but the housing crisis is so much on their mind that that's what they talk about for the first 10 or 15 minutes of our visit. They talk about the impact on their family. They talk about their desire to move, perhaps to have a bit more space if their family is growing, but they're feeling that they can't afford it. But they still want to remain in the neighborhood where their kids are growing up and going to school, and where perhaps they themselves grew up and went to school, and yet they're being priced out. Honourable Speaker, let me just read the first paragraph of a letter that's fairly typical. It's an angry letter I received from a constituent. I won't use the constituent's name because I haven't had an opportunity to get the constituent's permission, but it says, "Hello, Mr. Heyman." Oh, I guess I can't use my own name either. I apologize. Hello. I'm sorry you've received plenty of emails. I'm sure you've received plenty of emails concerning the state of the BC real estate market. I'm writing you today because in the last 2 years, I've made the most money I've ever made in my life, and I can't buy a home. I'm priced out. If I did manage to get into the market, I would be house poor. I've lived in BC since 1997 and spent most of that time in Vancouver. I contribute to our community. I, along with other citizens that have lived here for many years, are the reason Vancouver is the best place to live in the world. We built this city, and now we can't afford it. The influx of foreign investment is enticing for many, but for many more, it is a roadblock to the Canadian dream. Where is this money coming from? How is this money made? Does the government have answers to these questions? I don't believe we should welcome investment without understanding how it came to be. Honourable Speaker, I'll return to this point in a moment, but note that the constituent, the writer, astutely talked about investment and not citizenship. That's an important distinction, and it's one that is not made in the bill that we're debating today. Honourable Speaker, others of my colleagues have spoken at some length about our frustration on this side of the House, and I have to say the frustration of our constituents as well as at hearing the issues of housing, of the low rental vacancy rate in Vancouver in particular, but throughout Metro Vancouver, the difficulty in finding real estate that people can afford, and their desperation at wondering if they're losing their last chance to ever own a home in Metro Vancouver, but also in the South Island, in the interior, as this out-of-control price surge travels the province. Honourable Speaker, for months we received disdain from the other side of the House. We received incredibly statements that that the investment of foreign money driving up the cost of real estate in Metro Vancouver in particular was actually a sign of a healthy BC economy, that we should welcome it, that there weren't problems, that people who were raising the issue of affordability or access to housing were whining, that that we didn't need to keep statistics more than we kept, that the actions of the self-regulating real estate council were just fine. Honourable Speaker, when it suits this government, when this government believes that an issue has spiraled out of control and could be costly to them, they're very quick to pivot, or as columnist Michael Smith noted today in the province, very, very quick to flip-flop. Honourable Speaker, what we see before us today is a bill to address a number of issues, but unfortunately address them inadequately, address them in some ways from the wrong direction, and somewhat offensively act as if the moral authority now rests with the government side that has taken prompt and concrete action, as they would say, to address this issue, as if the opposition, as if constituents of ours, all of ours on both sides of the House, as if MLAs, as if members of the public, as if columnists and commentators, as if even the Bank of Canada hadn't raised this continually as a significant issue, a potential a threat to markets and equity. This government finally has taken haphazard action. Honourable Speaker, the Premier was quoted in the paper recently as saying that you can't draft these kinds of provisions on the back of a napkin. It takes careful thought. But Honourable Speaker, it seems pretty clear that there wasn't a lot of thought put into this, and particularly not put into these measures over a long period of time. So, Honourable Speaker, let's talk first of all about a couple of the issues that are being addressed by this bill. The first one is the property transfer tax of 15% on foreign nationals. Honourable Speaker, my colleagues before me have said clearly, and experts in housing from universities have also said, the issue is foreign investment, not the nationality of somebody who chooses to buy a home. Somebody may come to Vancouver, as was stated earlier today by the member for Vancouver Point Grey, because they have found a job or they've been recruited to a good job. They may plan to stay for 3 years, for 5 years, for 6 years, for 7 years. Perhaps they think if they really like it here, they may stay their whole life, and at that point choose to make a decision about permanent resident status or citizenship. But for the time being, they simply want to live, work, and pay taxes in British Columbia. Under this bill, Honourable Speaker, they will pay taxes all right. They'll pay an extra 15% tax that won't get to the root of the problem, because they aren't the root of the problem. They're living in Vancouver seeking accommodation. They are not shoveling speculative investment money into British Columbia without paying taxes in British Columbia, without living in British Columbia, while driving up the price of real estate for people who wish to purchase homes and live in British Columbia. In Metro Vancouver, we're now seeing a spillover effect to Victoria and the South Island. We're seeing knock-on effects in other parts of the province. This is spreading. Honourable Speaker, many people have told this government that the issue is one of investment, non-resident investment that is driving up prices. There are related issues. It's the source of the money. There's suspicions of money laundering. There's suspicions of tax evasion. Commentators have said, for instance, on the radio that the Chinese government has no interest in seeing capital flight from its country, which is the source of much of the investment money in real estate coming into this province. So many people say. And that the Chinese government would readily work with the British Columbia and Canadian government to find ways to stem this, but this bill does nothing to do that. This bill simply says if you're not a citizen or a permanent resident, you will pay a 15% property transfer tax. Honourable Speaker, that simply won't address the issue, not to mention the number of loopholes that could be available, investors channeling money through citizens or permanent residents, through corporations that are set up to accept that investment and then continue to drive up real estate prices. So, Honourable Speaker, this tax will have some effect, but it does not get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is real estate investment speculation with money which in many cases is untracked, inappropriately tracked, and suspect. This has all the earmarks of addressing the issue for people who don't scratch very far below the surface, but what British Columbians and residents of Metro Vancouver really deserve is a well thought out approach that gets to the root of the problem, and this simply doesn't do it. Honourable Speaker, another feature of the bill is a Housing Priority Initiatives Fund for provincial housing and rental programs. It says the fund will start with $75 million and going forward will receive a portion of revenue from the property transfer tax, including the new foreign buyer tax. But it doesn't say, Honourable Speaker, that all the money from the foreign buyer tax or a significant portion of the property transfer tax. I'm glad that the Minister of Environment is amused, but this is a real issue for British Columbians. A real issue for British Columbians is access to housing, access to affordable housing, access to rental properties, and that's what I and others regularly hear in our offices. We hear of people being evicted and having to go on the market looking for rental housing and actually having to bid against others, much as people who are seeking to buy a house have to bid up the price to have a chance to get it. People are now having to bid up rents in order to have a chance to find a place to rent. That's a problem for them. It's a problem for people who want to live in Vancouver, who grew up in Vancouver, but it's also an economic problem for the Lower Mainland. Honourable Speaker, many employers in the tech sector, as well as other sectors, have approached me about the dual problem of trying to attract and retain their employees when they can't find housing or they can't afford housing, and if they choose to live further out in the suburbs of Metro Vancouver, they can't efficiently get to work because this government has simply ignored the need to expedite the development of rapid transit in Metro Vancouver by working with the mayors to do so. So, Honourable Speaker, we need to see a more concrete commitment to investment in provincial housing and rental programs. This government has abandoned many opportunities to do that. The housing minister has spoken in this House about how they're getting out of the social housing business or are out of it and simply provide money for shelters, for short-term and emergency shelters now. That's the wrong direction for affordable housing, Honourable Speaker. The other thing that this government could have done would be to work with and urge the federal government to reinvest in co-op housing programs and nonprofit housing societies in order to help address the issue of affordable housing in Metro Vancouver and elsewhere in the province. But it hasn't done that. And further, Honourable Speaker, to add insult to injury, this government, where it has publicly owned land that could be made available for co-ops, for nonprofit housing on long-term leases, long-term affordable leases, or even sales that were specifically designated for affordable housing and rental housing, although that, in my view, would not be necessary, sold them off at cents on the dollar in order to balance the budget in the first couple of years of this term. I won't need to go into detail on some of the well below market value sales that were indulged in by the finance minister in order to make the books meet the target, but there were far better uses for those lands in the public interest, and this government owed it to the public to make the best use of those lands, not for short-term political gain, and they simply didn't do that. Honourable Speaker, another feature of this bill is the Premier claiming we are cracking down on shady practices in the real estate industry. We will end self-regulation, end the self-regulation that was brought in by this government in the first place, with spurious claims that self-regulation would lead to better protection of the public while reducing so-called red tape. Instead, Honourable Speaker, it has led to a plethora of shady real estate practices, to the shame and dismay of honourable realtors who don't like to see their profession brought down in the public eye by the disreputable actions of some. And let me use just one example from my constituency, Honourable Speaker. A woman in her late 70s in my constituency was approached by a real estate agent a few years ago, and she was urged to sell to this agent in a private sale because the agent said, "I love this home. This would be perfect for me. Even my dogs would love romping in the backyard of your home." And this woman, who was looking to downsize and find a place that she could live in without facing the maintenance of a detached home with a yard, although one she had lived in and loved for many, many years, was tempted by this agent because she wanted the home to go to someone who would love it and care for it. And the agent promised to be that person. Honourable Speaker, in less than 4 weeks after that sale closed, the agent flipped the home to a realtor with whom she had a relationship for a 25% increase, or about $400,000 profit in 4 weeks. That's the kind of action that self-regulation brings you, and it is great that this government has finally discovered that their reliance on self-regulation for real estate simply had to be ended. There are many other examples where this government's reliance on self-regulation should also be suspect and also called into question. We'll see what it will take for the government to address those problems. But, Honourable Speaker, the real estate industry itself, many realtors at least, believe that things have gone too far, that there's too many realtors looking for a quick buck or a quick $400,000, and that things need to be brought to heel. Let me turn now, Honourable Speaker, to the issue of amendments to the Vancouver Charter to provide Vancouver with the authority to implement a vacancy tax in order to make more rental stock available by ensuring that people have a big incentive to rent their vacant properties. This has been requested by Vancouver. It's being welcomed by Vancouver. However, Vancouver also says, the Mayor of Vancouver also says that they need provincial assistance with data in order to help design both a tax and a tax implementation regime that can be effective. But this is a good move, and I see the government has responded quickly to the request of the City of Vancouver and the City of Vancouver's mayor. But it's not just the City of Vancouver and the City of Vancouver's mayor who have asked for this assistance. The Mayor of Oak Bay, the Mayor of Victoria, other mayors have said, wait a minute, amending the Vancouver Charter doesn't help us. We would like to see this right extended to us. And while I acknowledge that the government has left within its power by regulation to extend the right to impose a vacancy tax to other municipalities. This legislation was drafted so hastily that they chose not to do it today. They chose not to do it in this sitting. They chose not to do it in this bill. And by doing so, they have created two classes of municipality in this province. One might argue that there already are two classes, but regardless, this government has perpetuated that, and it will be some time before we know if concerns being raised by mayors in the South Island or potentially by mayors in other parts of Victoria will have the same response from this government. Honourable Speaker, there is a real fear. There is a real fear that some of the features of this bill will actually drive real estate speculation to other parts of the province, causing housing crises in those parts of the province, whether it's the South Island, Victoria, whether it's Kelowna, whether it's other areas of British Columbia. It is a real problem that this government apparently has not clearly thought out or clearly come to terms with. What we don't need to do is to take the crisis that's now facing Metro Vancouver in a huge degree and facing other parts of British Columbia to a somewhat lesser degree and expand that, that horrific impact of affordability or a lack of rental accommodation to other parts of the province. Honourable Speaker, it is very, very interesting and instructive, as I mentioned earlier, to look at some of the claims and statements by this government over the past number of months, as my colleague from Point Grey, as my colleagues from other constituencies around the province have attempted to bring the government's attention to the housing crisis, the affordability crisis, the lack of rental stock, and other issues that concern my constituents and concern their constituents, and I expect concern the constituents of the members opposite. Because when you look at some of the statements, you have to wonder, Honourable Speaker, you have to wonder what members of the government side were thinking when they made them and how they managed to do the mental gymnastics to justify the complete flip-flop that this bill represents. Let me start with some quotes from the minister responsible for housing. In May 2015, the minister said, "If you look at the mean cost of housing across British Columbia or the mean of the Lower Mainland and compare it to other cities worldwide, the reason it's attractive internationally is because it's actually pretty reasonable." Honourable Speaker, I've quoted this to constituents who've come to my office to talk about the affordability issue and the cost of housing in my riding of Vancouver Fairview, and it is a moment of comic relief for them because they can't believe that anybody could actually make a statement that the cost of housing in the Lower Mainland is actually quite reasonable when it clearly isn't. It hasn't been for a long time, and over the last year, we've seen it skyrocket by over 30%. I mean, what a ludicrous statement, Honourable Speaker. The minister went on to say on the same day, "There's no initiative at this time in government to go and interfere in the marketplace with regard to housing." Okay, I guess something changed there. "There's no initiative or research that we're doing from this ministry with regards to that." So, Honourable Speaker, that was about a couple of months ago. Apparently, the government has now done adequate research in 2 months or perhaps in 26 days, judging by recent statements by the finance minister, to put together a comprehensive plan to actually interfere, as the minister said, in the marketplace with regards to housing to control an issue that is a real issue of both accommodation and shelter for people in British Columbia, but for this government apparently isn't an issue until it becomes a political issue. And then we have the Premier, Honourable Speaker, who in June said, if you can't afford to buy in Vancouver, you should just leave. She said, and I quote, "There are lots of great places to live. Fort St. John is booming." Well, Honourable Speaker, I've been to Fort St. John, and the people there don't think it's booming. But the Premier can believe that if she will, or at least try to sell it to the rest of the province. And she says, and it won't be long before you see we need lots of new people up in Kitimat and Prince Rupert. Well, last time I checked, Honourable Speaker, people in Kitimat were still waiting for the promised bonanza from the 2013 campaign by the Liberal government, and they have yet to see it. But leaving all of that aside, Honourable Speaker, if the government doesn't want to interfere in the marketplace, then it shouldn't certainly interfere in people's family lives and their choices of where to live, where to find employment, or whether to stay in the place where they grew up, where they were raised, or where they're choosing to raise their kids. Honourable Speaker, many people need to live in Metro Vancouver because that's where there is work for them. That's where they've been recruited. And many, many employers, as I said earlier, have said, we're having trouble recruiting. The cost of housing is too high, and it's making it difficult for us. We can't compensate people for the level of the cost of housing because there is no relationship between the cost of housing, and now there is getting to be no relationship between the cost of rental accommodation and people's incomes. And that is, Honourable Speaker, as a result of real estate investment speculation driven by foreign money, not by foreign nationals necessarily who live in Vancouver, work in Vancouver, live and work in other parts of the province and pay taxes to British Columbia and Canada, but people who aren't here, pay no taxes here, and simply choose to use real estate in Metro Vancouver and in the South Island and in Kelowna and potentially other parts of the province as a way to either launder money or get rich. That is the problem. It's hurting the economy. It's hurting the ability to recruit and retain, and it is one of the reasons, along with the issue we raised earlier today about the lack of the proper educational supports to graduate people in computer sciences, engineering, graphics, and animation, and computer science skills, that drove Vancouver from 4th to 14th in availability of trained tech talent in a mere period of 3 years between 2012 and 15. That, Honourable Speaker, is the result of this government's failure to address this issue before it spiraled out of control. Honourable Speaker, let me turn to the Finance Minister. May 2016. We're actually proud of the fact that we have a jurisdiction in British Columbia that people want to come to, that they feel that they can succeed in, that they want to invest in. So, Honourable Speaker, on the one hand, the Finance Minister a couple of months ago says they're proud of this and they don't want to intervene, and 2 months later actually penalizes people who come here to work and fails to necessarily penalize people who come to invest. He went on to say, Honourable Speaker, tell us about the vacancy tax. Tell us about the economic wall he and his colleagues would build if, God forbid, they were ever given the chance to govern British Columbia. Well, Honourable Speaker, apparently the Finance Minister has just demonstrated what this government would do as a wall. Unfortunately, the wall is in the wrong place. The wall is walling off people who want to come and contribute to BC's economy and live here, instead of a wall that blocks the investment from people who won't live here but want to make it difficult for the people who do. Honourable Speaker, I will vote for this bill, but British Columbians deserve a bill and an act that goes far beyond the meager offering that has been put forward by the Premier and Finance Minister with this bill. And with that, Honourable Speaker, I'll take my place.